Okay, so we've been talking about the color of an image and the different ways to modify the color of an image. Let's go ahead and talk about the tone of an image in this video. The tone is probably one of the most important things when it comes to photography and photo editing, and it's very important to know what tone means and what the different tones are in your image. So the tone of an image is the amount of light present in different regions of your image. So your image can have blacks, shadows, midtones, highlights, and whites, and these different regions are basically the different tones in your image. So if you look at the range of different tones you can have, on the left side you have all the blacks, right? And then as you move on, you get your shadows. And here you have your midtones. The highlights, and then the whites. So as you can see, the amount of light increases from the left to the right. So let's start with the blacks. What blacks means is this region here has no details. This region here, the whites, it has no details as well. So basically it's completely black and completely white. So the details are not present in these regions, right? These regions are just void of any details. Now once you move from the blacks to the shadows, you start seeing a little bit of details. The blacks are the regions of your image that are totally black. Once you enter the shadows, you have the dark regions of your image that have some details. And then you have the midtones. Midtones are basically, as the word says, the tones right in between. So what it means is if you have a black and white image, the gray regions of your image would be the midtones, right? So the ones that the regions that are kind of right in between and have sufficient details are called the midtones. Now once you enter the highlights here, the highlights are regions that are brighter than the midtones and they still have some details. So they're the bright regions of your image that contain details. And then you enter the whites where it's completely white. There is no detail in your image. So let's look at an example here to understand what these different regions are in an image. So here is an image that I shot at Tahoe last year. And if we try to look at this image, you can see that it has bright regions, it has dark regions, it has some completely white regions, it has some completely black regions. So let's go ahead and look at the leftmost portion of our range, which is the blacks. Can you see where the blacks are in this image? So you can see that these trees here, these trees, there is a lot of black regions, right? So let's go ahead and try to get those black regions. So this section that you see here is the same range as the one that I drew earlier on over here. So this is the same range, and I'm going to use this to show you the different regions of the image here. Okay, so let me go ahead and start removing all the white regions so that only the black regions are visible. So can you see that? Now I have just the black regions of the image shown here. As I was saying, the trees are mostly all the black regions present in this image. So this region has all the blacks. Now you can see only the black regions in this image. Let's go ahead and change our blending options so that we can see the shadow regions and not the black regions, right? Now you can see regions that are not black, that are not completely black, but have some details. So as you can see here, these regions have some details in them. You can see those little bit of details, right? They're not completely black. Let's go ahead and see how the midtones look. Let's move this right to the midsection of the image. So those are your midtones. You can see the sky has a lot of midtones where it's not completely bright, it's not completely dark, it's not completely black, it's not completely white. It's exactly somewhere in between. And even the mountains have some brown kind of regions here that are also right in between, right? Now let's go ahead and change our background to black because we are entering the white regions. So we need to be able to see it across on a black background. All right, so let's go ahead and see what the highlights are. So I'm going to move this into the highlight section. So these here. So the background here is black, right? And the non-black regions, whatever you can see, are the highlights. You can see these regions, they're pretty bright, right? Look at this region, it's pretty bright. And this region on the mountains here, they're also the highlights. So you can see it's pretty easy to understand. Now let's go and look at the completely white regions in this image. So what I'm going to do is shift my range here to complete whites. This image doesn't have a lot of complete whites, but you can see that these complete white regions, they don't have any details in them. It's just plain pure white. You see that? Cool. This is the whole image consisting of all the tones. Now let's take another example. This one here, as you can see, has a lot of whites and a lot of highlights. So let's go ahead and do the same thing here, but this time you should be able to see that when I change it to my black section, there's really nothing here. There's absolutely nothing. But as I change the range to show the whites, you can see that there's so much of the image in the whites, right? This shows you how much of this image has whites versus blacks. So what we'd say is that this image is really bright because it has most of its tones in the white section or the highlights. A little bit in the midtones, but very, very few sections are completely black or in the shadows. And let's look at an image that has a lot of blacks and a lot of shadows. So let's do the same thing for this. And if I go into the highlights, you'd still probably be able to see some highlights near the sun, but they're very few, right? And if I really want to look at the highlights, I need to have a black background. So you see, it's very few highlights in this image, very few whites and very few highlights. But let's look at the shadows. For the shadows, I turn on the white background, and this is what I do. You can see most of this image is in the dark section. You see all of this part is black, and these are all shadows. So you can see there's so much of this image, except for this area where the sun is setting. Most of this image is in the shadows and in the blacks, right? So we looked at a bright image, we looked at a dark image. Let's look at something in the midtones. So this image here has most of the image in midtones. Obviously there are some sections that are in the shadows. As you can see, the subject is mostly in the shadows in this image, but other than that, all the remaining section here, it's all absolutely midtones. So how can you see that? Well, let's do the same thing here. Select my layer and go to blending options. And let's first try to see what it has, right? If I do this, as I said, there's not much in the shadows. All there is my subject and this little section here. If I go into the highlights, the brightest sections of the image, again, you don't see a lot here. There's a little bit of the sky, but not much. Most of this image, as we can see, is in the midtone section. So you see that? All of this ground, all of this background here is all in the midtone section. So that's what I mean by this image being mostly midtones. So what we've learned is that the different tones of an image are the blacks, the shadows, the midtones, the highlights, and the whites. And in a tool like Lightroom or Photoshop, you have the ability to modify each of these sections on their own. So how do we do that? So there are a lot of ways that you can do this, but the way that I prefer, especially for raw photos, which this particular one is, I go to filter and select camera raw filter. And when you do that, you get this whole window here. And this window, as you can see, so what you see here is that it has something called highlights, something called shadows, something called white, something called blacks. And you can modify each of these sections. If you want to modify the midtones, exposure is what you use. But these sections really allow you to modify each of the different individually, right? So let's try to do that. So as you can see, the subject, as I showed you before, the subject here is in the shadows and it's looking pretty dark, right? So let's try and bring the subject's brightness up. Let's try to change it from the shadows to somewhere near the midtones, right? So how do you do that? Well, all I have to do is select the shadows and bring it up. You see what's happening? Now you can see that my subject has come out of the midtones and has come out of the shadows and has entered the midtones. And if I want to bring down the brightness of my sky, for example, I select the highlights and take it down. If I take it up, it goes completely bright. Take it down, it gets to the range that I really want it to be. The whites, bring it down just a little bit. There are no whites, but the blacks, bring it up, bring it down. Doesn't really matter. There are not that many blacks in the image. So as you can see, these different sections can be used to affect your image differently. And that's what makes tones such an important tool that all photographers, photo editors, and everyone who's interested in it should know about.